Sit down, Serena. We're not doing this.
I just want to understand.
There's nothing to understand. It was handled.
Handled.
Dario Bellini had spent 20 years reading people, their fears, their limits, the exact moment they would fold. That morning, he studied his wife and saw exactly what he always had. Someone who would absorb the damage and stay. He had no idea she was already gone. Not physically, not yet, but Serena's silence hadn't been acceptance. It had been a decision made quietly over months, by a woman who had stopped arguing and started preparing instead. The question wasn't whether she had a plan. The question was what Dario would find when he finally walked through that door. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, subscribe before this story is over. You'll want to see how it ends. Dario Bellini had built his empire the way most men build a reputation, one careful decision at a time, over 20 years, until the city itself seemed to move around him rather than the other way around. His real estate holdings stretched across 4 boroughs. His investment funds were clean on paper, well-structured, reviewed by accountants who knew exactly which questions not to ask. And beneath all of it, threaded through the legitimate architecture like a second skeleton, ran the financial network that had made him untouchable. He didn't think of it as criminal. He thought of it as infrastructure. In Dario's world, every relationship had a function. His attorneys kept him protected. His business partners kept him profitable. His associates kept him feared. And Serena kept everything else running in a way that never required his attention, which was exactly how he preferred it. She managed the penthouse, attended the events, smiled at the right people, and said the right things when the cameras were close. She was, by any measure, the ideal wife of a powerful man. And Dario had long since stopped wondering whether that was enough for her. He hadn't always been so blind to it. There was a version of their early years he still carried somewhere, Serena with paint on her fingers, arguing passionately about light and color and the way a canvas could hold something a photograph never could. She had been studying fine arts when they met. She had wanted to be a painter. He remembered thinking it was charming. He had never asked, later, what happened to that wanting. It simply disappeared, the way certain things do when a life gets restructured around someone else's priorities, and Dario had accepted its absence without ever registering the loss. By the time the signs appeared, he had already stopped paying close enough attention to read them. Serena noticed things he didn't notice about himself, the way he started tilting away from her when his phone rang at night, the business trips that stretched without explanation, the password on his phone that changed without mention. She noticed Camille Duval appearing at more and more of the organization's social events, standing a little too close, laughing a little too quickly at things Dario said. Serena said nothing about any of it. She watched, and she thought, and she stayed quiet in the particular way of someone who is not deciding whether to act, but when. Dario read her silence as acceptance. That was his first mistake, though he wouldn't understand it for a long time. The night everything shifted, Serena left the charity dinner early. A headache. She told the table she'd take a car back. He should stay. Dario watched her go with the mild, distracted attention of a man who had stopped seeing what he was looking at. He stayed another hour, then left for Camille's. Serena was home before him. She heard the music before she reached the bedroom, something low and deliberate, the kind chosen for a specific purpose. The door wasn't fully closed. She pushed it open. What happened next was not a scene of chaos. There was no shouting, no shattered glass, no dramatic confrontation. Serena stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her husband, and Dario looked back at her. That was the moment. Not the betrayal itself, which she had suspected long enough that the visual confirmation carried less shock than she expected. What she hadn't anticipated, what she would turn over in her mind for the rest of that night, was the expression on his face. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't devastated. He wasn't even ashamed. The look that crossed Dario Bellini's face when he saw his wife standing in the doorway was the look of a man who had been interrupted at something inconvenient. A flicker of annoyance. That was all. Serena held his gaze for a few seconds. Then she turned and walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and stood at the window looking out at the city below. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the sharp, burning thing she might have expected. She felt something quieter and more final, the specific stillness that comes when a question you've been carrying for a long time finally gets answered. When Camille left and Dario came into the kitchen, his voice was already arranged into the controlled, measured tone he used when he needed to manage a situation. He told her it wasn't what she'd seen. He said they should talk about it rationally. Serena listened, and when he finished, she told him she understood and asked him to go to sleep. In the morning, he made breakfast. He gave her the apology he had clearly spent the night preparing, careful, not too elaborate, designed to close the conversation without reopening it. Serena listened again. She said she understood again. She meant neither instance. Dario accepted both, poured his coffee, and left for a 9 o'clock meeting, convinced that his wife had processed the situation with the same practical calm she brought to everything else. He believed that because it was easier to believe, and because the alternative that the woman across the breakfast table had already made a decision he didn't know about had never occurred to him as a real possibility. After he left, Serena sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Not from grief and not from uncertainty. She already knew what she was going to do. What she was calculating was how to do it in a way that actually worked, because walking out of Dario Bellini's life was not the same as walking out of anyone else's. She called Celia Barron that afternoon. Celia was a family law attorney who operated completely outside the professional network. Dario had spent 2 decades cultivating someone he had no leverage over, no relationship with, no reason to monitor. When they met, Celia laid out the landscape plainly. Dario had significant resources, significant connections, and no reason to let a divorce proceed on terms favorable to Serena. The process would be fought at every step if he chose to fight it. Serena told her she understood and that she had no intention of leaving before she was ready. She wasn't ready yet, but she was starting. Over the following months, life in the penthouse continued to look exactly the same from the outside. Serena attended every event, sat beside Dario at every dinner, maintained every habit and routine that made their marriage look functional to the people watching it. She smiled at his colleagues and asked the right questions and gave nothing away. Dario continued seeing Camille. He seemed to interpret Serena's consistency as confirmation that the incident had been absorbed and moved past. She let him think so. What she was actually doing, beneath all of it, was methodical. She opened a bank account under her maiden name Belandi at a branch in a part of the city she didn't ordinarily visit. She made small transfers at irregular intervals, nothing that would pattern into a flag. She had always had access to the household accounts. It had never occurred to Dario to restrict that access, because it had never occurred to him she might use it for something he hadn't sanctioned. She began quietly reviewing the financial documents that passed through the penthouse reports, filings, organizational summaries, and she read them with more attention than she had ever pretended to pay them before. She had spent 14 years in proximity to how Dario's empire worked. She understood more of it than anyone had given her credit for understanding. She leased a small apartment in a coastal town about 2 hours south of the city, paying the deposit in cash, using her maiden name. She applied for a position at a local art gallery and was offered the job based on a conversation that had nothing to do with who she had been for the last 14 years. She started moving things slowly, in manageable quantities, on days when Dario was traveling. Books, photographs, the paintings she had bought before she married him, which he had always ignored because they didn't match the aesthetic of the penthouse. The small objects that meant something to her for reasons that had nothing to do with their cost. The things she left behind, the gowns, the jewelry, the expensive gifts accumulated across 14 years, she left deliberately. They were beautiful. They were also his choices, his taste, his version of what a wife in his position should look like. She had no use for them in the life she was building. On the evening she chose, when Dario was away and wouldn't be back until late, Serena let herself take one last look at the penthouse. The view from the window was extraordinary. It always had been. She had looked at it 10,000 times and never quite felt like it belonged to her, which, she understood now, was because it never had. She set her key on the kitchen counter. She placed the divorce papers beside it, prepared and signed through Celia's office. She wrote a single line on a notepad in her own handwriting and left it next to the key. Then she picked up the bag she'd packed the week before and walked out. She didn't look back at the door. She drove south on the highway with the windows down and the radio on, and by the time the city disappeared in her rearview mirror, she was already thinking about the apartment, the gallery, the morning light on the water she'd seen once during a visit and never forgotten. Dario came home after midnight. He came through the front door, already loosening his tie, already moving toward the kitchen out of habit, and he saw the key first, then the papers, then the note in Serena's handwriting. "I'm done, don't look for me." He read it once, he read it again. He walked through the rooms slowly, not searching, just looking. The closet on Serena's side of the bedroom was empty. The photographs that had hung in the hallway were gone, leaving clean rectangles on the wall where the paint was slightly darker. The side of the bathroom vanity she had used for 14 years was bare. He stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time, looking at those empty spaces, and the apartment was so quiet around him that it felt less like a home someone had left and more like a place that had never quite been one to begin with. In the days that followed, Dario did what he had always done when something in his life stopped working the way it was supposed to. He managed it. He assigned it a category, handed off the pieces that could be delegated, and kept moving. He called Conrad Rains, his attorney of 11 years, and told him to begin processing the divorce on Dario's terms: asset division, legal separation, the standard framework for a high net worth split. Conrad said he would handle it. Dario said good and moved on to his next call. The problem was that the penthouse couldn't be delegated. He came home to it every night, and every night the silence was the same specific kind, not peaceful, not neutral, but hollow. The kind of silence that exists because something that used to fill a space no longer does. He avoided the hallway where the photographs had hung. He used only the kitchen and his office and the bedroom, moving through the apartment with the careful efficiency of someone who had informally cordoned off everything else. He told himself this would pass. Men adapted. He had rebuilt from worse. But he'd never come home before, to a place that felt like it had already forgotten him. He ended things with Camille within a week of Serena's departure. It wasn't a difficult conversation, or rather, it was difficult for Camille, and not particularly for Dario, which told him something about the nature of what they'd had. He told her directly that their arrangement had no future, that it never had, and that continuing it served neither of them. Camille had clearly expected a different outcome. She had spent 2 years operating on an assumption that Serena was a temporary obstacle, that once she was gone, the landscape would rearrange itself in Camille's favor. Watching her face as he spoke, Dario saw the exact moment she understood that no such promise had ever been made. Not explicitly, not implicitly. She had built that expectation entirely on her own. She left his office without responding to his last sentence. What Dario heard about 2 weeks later was her father. Etienne Duval had been a capital partner in 2 of Dario's development projects, not a major player, but a real one, and the kind of partner whose withdrawal creates a visible gap. Etienne pulled his money out of both projects within the same week, without formal notice, in a way that was technically permitted by their agreements and practically designed to cause maximum disruption. Tens of millions of dollars reorganized out of Dario's pipeline overnight, and the message behind the move was not subtle. Etienne believed his daughter had been used, and he intended for that to cost something. Other partners noticed. Capital is attentive to instability in ways that people sometimes aren't, and the sudden withdrawal of a known associate sent a ripple through the network that Dario could feel but not immediately stop. He managed the public-facing damage, made calls, gave reassurances. Beneath the reassurances, he knew the fracture was real. It was Conrad who brought him the information that changed everything. 3 weeks into the divorce proceedings, Conrad requested an urgent meeting. He came in with the particular expression Dario had learned over 11 years, meant the news was not just bad but structural. Conrad told him that Celia Barron, the attorney Serena had retained, had met with a federal financial crimes agent named Evelyn Sloan 2 days after Serena left the penthouse. A second meeting had followed shortly after, this time with the addition of a federal prosecutor. Dario let Conrad finish. Then he asked him to say it plainly. Conrad said it plainly. The financial documents Serena had been quietly copying over the months before she left, the reports, the filings, the organizational summaries that had moved through the penthouse, unremarked, had given federal investigators enough visibility into the structure of Dario's operations to identify the connections between his legitimate businesses and the financial network running beneath them. The investigation was already open. It had been open, in fact, since shortly after Serena walked out the door. Dario sat with that for a moment. He thought about the way Serena had sat across from him at 100 dinners while his colleagues discussed business. He thought about the papers she had access to, the conversations she had been present for, the 14 years of proximity to the architecture of everything he had built. He had never thought to restrict any of it because it had never occurred to him that she was paying attention. She was the wife. She managed the house and attended the events. She wasn't someone who understood how his empire worked. Except that she did. She had understood it for years, quietly, without ever letting him know she was watching. And at some point, probably the morning after she stood in the kitchen with a glass of water, while he tried to explain away what she'd seen, she had decided to use that understanding not as a weapon against him, but as a shield for herself. She hadn't taken the documents to leverage a better divorce settlement. She hadn't used them to threaten him, or extract money, or publicly destroy him. She had handed them to people with the authority to make Dario's world too legally exposed to risk coming after her. She had made herself unreachable in the one way his money and connections couldn't reach back. The woman he had written off as passive as someone who wouldn't survive outside the structure of their marriage had executed the one move that left him completely unable to respond without accelerating his own destruction. Conrad laid out 3 options in the careful way he had of delivering choices that were not really choices. Dario could fight the investigation contest, everything, let it become a years-long legal battle, and hope the evidence wasn't as complete as it appeared to be. He could disappear, which Conrad phrased more delicately, but which meant exactly that. Or he could approach the federal side proactively while he still held some negotiating position and begin a process of cooperation before the terms were dictated entirely by the other side. Every instinct Dario had pointed toward the first option. He had spent 20 years responding to threats with force, financial force, legal force, the specific kind of social force that came from being someone people were afraid to publicly oppose. He did not have a reflex for surrender, and cooperation felt like surrender dressed in procedural language. But Conrad walked him through the arithmetic of what fighting would actually cost, and the arithmetic was brutal. The evidence was not incomplete. It was, if anything, more thorough than Dario would have expected from the wife he had never thought to monitor. What stopped him from dismissing the third option outright wasn't strategy. It was Enzo. His younger brother had been with him from the beginning, not in the operational sense, not in the ways that would have left a clear legal trail, but close enough that an aggressive federal investigation would inevitably pull his name into proximity with things he hadn't directly done. Enzo had a wife and 2 young children. He had spent the last several years trying to move his own career into fully legitimate territory, quietly and without drawing attention to the transition. If Dario chose to fight and lost, Enzo's life would be consumed by the fallout in ways that had nothing to do with choices Enzo had made. Dario asked Vittorio Renzetti to bring him everything. Vittorio was his financial manager, 15 years in the role, trusted with the layers of the operation that most people in the organization never saw. He spread the records across the table in Dario's office, and Dario spent the better part of a day going through them with the specific attention of someone trying to see what an outside investigator would see. The structure he had built looked different when you examined it from that angle. It looked less like a successful empire and more like an elaborate system for avoiding consequences, which was, he understood in a way he hadn't let himself fully understand before, exactly what it was. He agreed to meet with Evelyn Sloan. The meeting was held through Conrad at a neutral location, under terms that kept it off any official record until Dario chose to formalize cooperation. He provided initial information about the organization's structure enough to demonstrate good faith, enough to begin establishing that he was a useful source rather than simply a target. He walked out of that meeting knowing he had just started a process he couldn't reverse. The empire he had spent 20 years building had begun, in that room, to come apart. The call from Etienne Duval came that same evening. It was not a long call. Etienne didn't need many words to make his point. He knew about the meeting. He knew who had been in the room and what category of conversation had taken place. He wanted Dario to understand that Enzo and the wider family were not yet safe, and that the current situation could develop in a number of directions depending on decisions that were still being made. Dario understood the message immediately. Someone had fed information to Etienne's network information about a meeting that was supposed to be entirely contained. He went back to Vittorio that night and began asking the kind of questions that Vittorio wasn't prepared for. It didn't take long. Vittorio had been in contact with people connected to Etienne's network before the meeting with Sloan, and during it, he had been afraid, genuinely afraid, that Dario would sacrifice him in the course of negotiating favorable terms, and so he had moved first, positioning himself as a source of information for the other side, in the hope that it would buy him protection regardless of what Dario decided. 15 years. The man had been inside the most sensitive layers of everything Dario had built for 15 years, and he had broken at the first real pressure because he had never believed, when it came down to it, that Dario would protect anyone's interests but his own. That assessment was not entirely wrong, which made it worse to sit with. The leak meant the federal side now had reason to believe Dario might be running a dual strategy, cooperating officially while using back channels to manage his exposure. If that interpretation took hold, the agreement would collapse. If it collapsed, Dario faced prosecution without the shield of cooperation, Enzo's name would surface without context to protect him, and Etienne would have leverage over the entire family that no amount of money could immediately neutralize. Dario stood in his office that night, the records still spread across the table in front of him, and cataloged what he had lost. The marriage. The sense that he had ever truly had a home. The loyalty of a man he had trusted with everything. The control he had exercised over every significant situation in his professional life for 2 decades. And the deep, structural certainty that had underlain all of it that power was sufficient, that if you accumulated enough of it in the right places, you could insulate yourself from any consequence. He had nothing left to fight with that wouldn't make the situation worse. There was no move available to him that didn't require, first, letting go of the person he had been. Evelyn Sloane was not a woman who softened her questions. When she sat across from Dario the morning after his call with Etienne, she looked at him for a moment before she spoke, and then she asked him directly, did he want the bureau to pick up Vittorio Renzetti, or did he want to handle it himself? She said it exactly like that. Not do you have a preference regarding how this is addressed. She asked whether he wanted the federal government to arrest his former financial manager, or whether he intended to take care of it through the methods his organization had historically used for problems of this kind. She asked it the way you ask a question when the answer is a character test, and everyone in the room knows it. Dario understood what she was doing. He also understood that she wasn't wrong to do it. He had spent 20 years building a reputation for handling his own problems, and there were people in this city who would tell you, if they trusted you enough, that handling problems was a euphemism with a specific meaning in Dario Bellini's organization. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the version of himself that had run this empire without interference for 2 decades was telling him that a man who betrays you after 15 years doesn't deserve a federal holding cell. He deserves something with more finality. Dario told Sloane he wanted the bureau to bring Vittorio in. He said it without elaborating, without qualifying it, and without looking away from her. Then he gave her everything he had on Etienne's call, the exact phrasing, the specific implication about Enzo and the family, the clear suggestion that someone inside the cooperation process had been feeding information to Duval's network. He laid it out in the methodical, precise way he had always laid out problems for the people who worked for him, and this time he laid it out for the people who were, in a real sense, deciding his future. It was the first time in his adult life that Dario Bellini had resolved a crisis without a threat, without money changing hands in a direction that benefited him, and without the implicit understanding that he was the most dangerous person in the room. He walked out of that meeting with nothing in his hands and no certainty about what came next. It wasn't quite fear. It was something closer to exposure, the sensation of having removed the armor and not yet knowing whether what was underneath it could survive the open air. Vittorio was arrested that same night at his apartment in the city. When confronted with the evidence assembled against him, his communications with Etienne's network, the timeline of his contacts before and during the meeting with Sloane, the financial trail connecting his private accounts to payments that had nothing to do with his salary, he agreed to cooperate within the first few hours. The calculation was not wrong, but it came too late to save him from a sentence. The information from both Dario and Vittorio gave federal investigators a clear picture of how Etienne Duval's network had penetrated the cooperation process. That leverage, combined with the financial exposure the investigation had already accumulated on Duval's own holdings, put Etienne in a position he hadn't anticipated. He had entered this situation believing he was applying pressure from a safe distance. He discovered over the following weeks that his own distance was considerably shorter than he'd thought. After several rounds of communication through attorneys, Etienne agreed to stand down no further actions against Dario, no moves against Enzo or his family, no continuation of whatever arrangement had connected him to Vittorio. Enzo got the call from Dario on a Tuesday afternoon. It was over, his name was clean, his family was untouched. He didn't say much in response. He didn't need to. Camille disappeared from the story, the way people do when the structure that gave them proximity to power collapses. She was not publicly disgraced. She was not mentioned in any filing or formal proceeding. She simply stopped appearing, stopped being someone that anyone in Dario's former circle thought about or referenced. She had entered this situation believing she was moving towards something, and she left it with less than she'd started with, quietly and without resolution. Of everyone who moved through this story, she was the only one who left it without having understood what it cost her. The formal terms of Dario's arrangement with the federal government took several more weeks to finalize, and they were not lenient. He cooperated in the prosecution of the associates who had directly operated the illegal financial network. He surrendered the companies and investment vehicles structurally tied to the money laundering operation. He accepted ongoing financial monitoring that would follow him for years. He lost the majority of the assets generated through or protected by the illegal side of his empire. He was not prosecuted. His fully legitimate businesses, the ones whose books were genuinely clean, were permitted to continue. On paper, Dario Bellini was still a wealthy man. In practice, he had lost the thing that wealth had always represented to him, the certainty that he was beyond consequence. He moved out of the penthouse within a month of the agreement being finalized. He told himself it was practical, the apartment was too large, too expensive to justify for one person, too visible in ways that no longer served him. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that every room held a specific configuration of empty space that corresponded to something Serena had taken or something Serena had been, and he could not stop mapping those spaces every time he walked through. He moved into a smaller apartment in a different neighborhood, a place with no memory of anyone, and began the considerably slower process of learning how to build something without the tools he had used for 20 years. He started with 2 small development projects, straightforward, fully legitimate, the kind of work that required negotiation and patience, instead of the leverage he used to bring to every table. It was harder than he expected, not technically harder, but in the way that doing something honestly is harder than doing it with an advantage you've manufactured in advance. It was slower. It was also cleaner in a way he didn't have a precise word for the feeling of knowing that what he was building would be standing in 5 years for the reason that it worked, not because he had kept everyone around it too afraid to let it fall. The divorce was finalized during this period. Serena received her portion of the legitimate marital assets, handled entirely through their attorneys. She didn't ask for more than what she was legally entitled to. She didn't try to extend the proceedings or use the process to damage him further. She took what was hers and closed the door. About 7 months after the agreement with the federal government was signed, long enough that the city had stopped watching, long enough that Dario had settled into the quieter rhythm of the life he was building, he went to the coastal town for work. A small mixed-use development project, 2 blocks from the water, the kind of straightforward, legitimate deal he was doing more of now. The meeting ended early. He walked along the waterfront because he had nowhere immediately to be. He saw Serena in front of a small grocery near the town's main square. She was wearing jeans and a lightweight knit sweater and a jacket that had seen better years. Choosing produce with the focused attention of someone who was not in a hurry and did not need to be anywhere else. No car waiting, no one with her. She looked, from 30 feet away, like someone who lived here. He could have kept walking. She hadn't seen him yet. He walked closer anyway, not with a plan, but because not doing so felt like a different kind of cowardice than the ones he was trying to leave behind. She saw him before he spoke. Her expression moved through something brief and unreadable and settled into something that was not hostile, but was not open either. She waited. He told her first that he hadn't known she was here, that he wasn't looking for her, that the visit was for work, and that he understood if she preferred he keep walking. Then, because she didn't ask him to go, he told her the rest of it. The agreement with the federal government, what it had cost, that the organization was gone, the structure he had spent 20 years building was in the process of being legally dismantled, and he was doing something different now. They sat on a bench near the square. Serena listened the way she had always listened, without interruption, without visible reaction, with the quality of attention that he had once taken for passivity and now recognized as something considerably more deliberate. When he finished, she told him why she had taken the documents. Not to punish him, not to win anything. Because she needed to ensure that the world she was leaving could not reach into the life she was building, and the only leverage that could guarantee that was leverage held by someone with the authority to make it real. She had handed Evelyn Sloan a key she never wanted to turn. She had just needed someone to be holding it. Dario told her he understood. He told her he was sorry, not with the calculated precision of the apology he had prepared over breakfast 14 months ago, but in the plain, undefended way of someone who had run out of better options and was no longer trying to manage the outcome. Serena said she believed him. She said the apology was real, and she recognized it as real, and that it didn't change what had already happened, because real apologies don't work backward. They only ever point forward. She told him she had forgiven him not for his sake, and not because his behavior after the fact had earned it, but because carrying 14 years of accumulated loss into her new life was a weight she had decided not to take. Forgiveness, she said, was not the same thing as reconciliation. Dario accepted that without trying to renegotiate it. Then he asked if she was happy. Serena looked out toward the end of the street, where the road curved and you could see, at the right angle, a strip of blue water between the buildings. "I'm painting again," she said. He understood, in the way that sentence landed in him, that he had not known she had stopped. Not really. He had known it as a fact she used to paint. She no longer painted, but he had never registered it as a loss, never thought to ask what it had cost her to let it go, never considered that the 14 years in which she had been the ideal wife of a powerful man were also 14 years in which she had been quietly setting down the most essential version of herself so that there was room for the life he needed her to have. Serena stood, told him she hoped things went well for him, and walked back toward the grocery store. Dario sat on the bench for a while longer, in the late afternoon light, with the particular feeling of a man who has arrived at the correct understanding of something too late for it to change the outcome, and who has learned, finally, that late understanding is still understanding, and that it has to be enough. He drove back to the city the next morning. The projects were waiting, the work was there. He was not the same man who had built the penthouse empire, and the city he was returning to was not the city that had once arranged itself around him. He was smaller in it now, and more honest, and he understood that these two things were connected. Serena went home that evening to her apartment 2 streets from the water. She put the groceries away, made tea, and went into the room she used as a studio. On the easel, a canvas she'd been working on for 2 weeks, the winter light on the ocean in the early morning, that particular blue-gray that existed for about 40 minutes before the sun came up fully and the color changed. She picked up the brush and kept going. They did not reconcile. They did not need to. Serena had walked out of a life that had slowly consumed her and found her way back to herself, not dramatically, not all at once, but one morning at a time, in a small room by the water with a brush in her hand. Dario had lost the empire, the marriage, and the certainty that power was a substitute for honesty. What he found in the wreckage was smaller and harder and more real than anything he had built before. The penthouse had been empty since the night she left, but the greatest emptiness was never in the rooms. It was in the 14 years he had spent building a life so focused on control that he never once stopped to ask the person beside him what she actually wanted from hers. Some losses only make sense in hindsight. Some people only become visible once they're gone. If this story made you think about someone you might be taking for granted, you're not alone in that. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you want more stories about the things we don't realize we're losing until it's already too late.